The Shroud of Turin is believed to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth.
Imagine you discover a strange image on an ancient piece of cloth. It shows in full detail the body of a man who has been beaten, crowned with thorns, and crucified, with bloodstains so precise that forensic doctors can read the entire history of his suffering from them. Even more astonishing, this image has three characteristics at the same time. It behaves like a photographic negative. It shows features like an X-ray image. It has properties similar to a hologram, a three-dimensional image, and yet it appeared centuries before photography was invented, before X-rays, before holograms. That is exactly what we are dealing with in the Shroud of Turin, the cloth that many believe to be the burial shroud of Jesus. The question is not only, is this really the burial cloth of Jesus? A deeper question is, how was this image formed at all? If it is just a painting, a hoax, or a random stain, science should be able to demonstrate that. But if the very act of resurrection left a physical imprint on the cloth, then we are standing before a strange kind of evidence, something that has never occurred a second time in history. This article summarizes the main arguments from imaging science, forensic medicine, and theology, all converging on one conclusion. The image on the Shroud of Turin is not a painting, not the product of ancient people using stone knives and animal skins, but the result of a phenomenon of light and energy emitted from the body of a man who died and rose again. From the shadows of Hiroshima to the mystery of the shroud, to understand how an image can be printed onto a surface without brush or ink, let's look at a modern historical event, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. After the explosion, people discovered on walls and sidewalks human shadows, outlines of those who had been standing there, apparently printed by the light. At first glance, you might think, someone painted these silhouettes on the wall, but the reality is quite the opposite. The human body blocked the blinding, intense light from the blast, and that light bleached the surrounding surface, changing the color of concrete, stone, and walls. As the areas shielded by the body kept their original color, creating the illusion of a dark shadow left behind. It was not the shadow being burned into the wall. It was the area around it that was bleached by intense light and heat, a photochemical and thermal process. The important points are, there was no direct contact between body and wall. The image was created by light and heat, not by ink, not by a brush, not by carving. Now, let's take that as a first analogy for the Shroud of Turin. The presenter makes it clear. The image on the shroud is not identical to the Hiroshima shadows, but there are important similarities. There is an extremely powerful light source. The body or object is very close to the recording surface, the wall, the pavement, or in this case, the cloth. Light, especially in the ultraviolet UV range, interacts with the surface, changing its chemical structure and color. The shades of light and dark in the image depend on the distance between the body and the surface. With Hiroshima, we see how light and heat can create images without a human hand touching the surface. With the Shroud of Turin, the story continues at a much higher level of complexity. 6 similarities and 1 crucial difference. When we compare the Hiroshima shadows and the image on the Shroud of Turin, we can summarize the key similarities as follows. 1. The object body is close to the recording surface. Hiroshima, people are standing or sitting close to the wall or pavement. Turin, the body lies above and below the linen cloth. 2. The image is darker where it is closer. Hiroshima, the feet and parts closer to the ground appear darker and clearer because they are very near the sidewalk. Turin, the parts of the body closest to the cloth, face, a chest, etc., produce the sharpest, clearest image. 3. The image fades as distance increases. Hiroshima, parts of the body farther from the wall or ground produce fainter shadows. Turin, where the cloth is farther from the body, for example, along the sides, the image grows faint and eventually disappears. 4. Ultraviolet, UV, light is involved in image formation. Hiroshima, the nuclear explosion produces a broad spectrum of radiation, including UV, which alters surfaces. Turin, all the data point to UVB, a form of ultraviolet light, as the most reasonable candidate to produce rapid aging, discoloration, on only an extremely thin surface layer of the linen fibers. 5. The surface acts like a film plate. Hiroshima, walls and sidewalks function as the film plate. Turin, the linen cloth is a double-sided film plate, one side in front of the body, one side behind. 6. The closer, the sharper. In both phenomena, resolution is highest where the object is closest to the recording surface. But it is the difference that makes the Shroud of Turin absolutely unique. In Hiroshima, the shadows do not encode detailed information about distance. You cannot look at them and know exactly how many centimeters away the person was from the wall. With the Shroud of Turin, the degree of shading across the cloth encodes the distance between body and cloth so precisely that when the image is run through a brightness analyzer, VP8 image analyzer, it produces an accurate 3D model of the body, precise down to the millimeter. This has never been observed in any painting, photograph, X-ray image, hologram, or any other human artifact. An ultra-thin image and one colored fibril out of 200. When a linen thread from the Shroud of Turin is magnified 10,000 times, researchers discovered something astonishing. Only about 1 out of every 200 fibrils, tiny subfibers, in a thread is discolored. The discolored fibrils are affected only on the outermost surface, with a thickness of about 1/100 of a human hair. There is no trace of ink, paint, dye, or any organic or inorganic pigment on the surface. This means no one could have painted the image like this. No ancient technique, and not even normal modern techniques, can affect exactly 1/100 fibril. At such a razor-thin surface layer, uniformly across a cloth over 4 meters long, this leads to a crucial scientific conclusion. The image was not created by adding paint, ink, or dye. It is the result of a highly localized process of rapid aging, dehydration, and oxidation on the linen surface. So what could cause rapid aging, dehydration? A sepia brown color change, limited only to an extremely shallow surface layer. On linen, the best answer the research group found after 500,000 hours of study is high-intensity UVB radiation, in a laser-like form, that is, single wavelength, very concentrated light, similar to a laser. From sun-tanned skin to discolored linen fibers, UVB. Interestingly, what happens on the shroud has a parallel in everyday life. Tanning of human skin, ultraviolet light, makes skin age faster, causes dehydration, triggers oxidative reactions, and turns the skin brown. However, with normal sunlight, UV rays are scattered in all directions, so they hit everything exposed, not one fibril out of 200 selectively. By contrast, the light that formed the shroud image behaves very much like a laser, a single wavelength, highly focused, strikes extremely small, extremely shallow points on the linen fibers. Therefore, scientists can rule out ordinary sunlight, like camera obscura experiments, and any primitive photography methods from the Middle Ages. The experiments that produced the closest reproductions of the shroud image on linen succeeded only when using an argon fluoride laser, operated under very special and controlled conditions. But one big question remains. Where did such laser-like light come from in the case of the shroud? Is there anything in the human body that emits laser-like light? This is where a little-known scientific fact appears. Human DNA emits photons. Modern research shows that every second, DNA in living cells emits around 100,000 to 1,000,000 photons, extremely faint light in the ultraviolet range. This light is invisible to the naked eye, but can be measured with sensitive instruments. The presenter argues, if this process were greatly amplified through some kind of electric field or resonant effect, then the DNA in a human body could become a source of laser-like UVB radiation. In that scenario, each cell, each DNA segment, could emit light at very precise frequencies, causing the linen fibers in direct proximity to undergo rapid aging, local dehydration, and a sepia color change. Then only in the outermost layer, and with the degree of coloration corresponding to the distance between cloth and skin. In other words, the body itself is the light source. That light leaves the body, passes through space, strikes the cloth, and encodes distance in the number of fibrils that are discolored. From this, a strong conclusion is drawn. The cloth did not just change color randomly. No one simply shone a lamp from outside onto the linen. It was the body inside the cloth that emitted the light, and that is why the image carries 3D information about that body. Negative, X-ray, hologram, all in one. The image on the Shroud of Turin is strange because it is a negative in terms of brightness. When photographed and viewed as a photographic negative, the image becomes much clearer. Details of the face, closed eyes, swelling, similar to how an X-ray film reveals detail after inversion. It has X-ray-like properties. In the area of the hands, you seem to see bones of the hands, as if the material has recorded not only the surface of the skin, but also internal structure. It has holographic qualities. The image is extremely superficial, only one very thin layer of fibrils. When the cloth is held up to the light from behind, the image is almost invisible, similar to how a hologram looks when viewed from the wrong side. And most importantly, when the image is analyzed in 3D with VP8, it forms a realistic three-dimensional shape, instead of the distorted mess you get with normal paintings or photographs. So the best description is an image that has properties of a photograph, an X-ray, and a hologram, but is not fully any one of them. There is no second example of such an image in human history, refuting the medieval forgery claim and the C14 dating issue. In 1988, some samples from the shroud were taken for radiocarbon dating, C14. The result suggested a date around the 14th century, and many quickly concluded it's a medieval fake. But materials analysts have pointed out a serious problem. The sampling area was at the edge of the cloth, where it had been repaired in the Middle Ages after heavy handling and damage. In that area, researchers found cotton fibers, which do not appear in the main body of the cloth, which is pure linen, madder root dye, used to tint the new patch to match the old cloth. In other words, the sample used for C14 dating did not represent the original cloth. It was a mixture of 1st century linen and 14th century repair fabric. From a legal or forensic perspective, that sample is contaminated. The dating result, if presented in a court of law, would be thrown out immediately as unreliable evidence. Meanwhile, the main body of the shroud contains no dye, contains no cotton, and has a weave, dimensions, and stitching pattern consistent with 1st century Middle Eastern textiles. Forensics, a beaten man, crowned with thorns, crucified, dead, and not decomposed. Independent forensic pathologists have analyzed the marks on the shroud and reached a consistent conclusion. This is the image of a real human body, not a statue, not a model. The man was severely scourged. Wounds cover his back, legs, and chest. He wore a kind of thorn crown, with at least 30 puncture marks around the head, matching a type of thorn plant from the Jerusalem area that he was crucified. Not simply tied. Nail wounds appear at the wrists and feet, with blood flows consistent with a crucified position. His body bears a side wound, with blood and fluid flow, clearly a post-mortem injury. The body posture shows rigor mortis, bent knees, stiff jaw, slightly swollen abdomen. All this indicates that he had been dead for about 48-72 hours from the cloth. More importantly, there is no sign of decomposition on the linen, no evidence of prolonged contact with a decaying corpse. Blood was transferred to the cloth first. The light image came later, meaning there were two separate events. 1. The body touched the cloth and blood soaked in. 2. A light-emitting phenomenon formed the image 48 to 72 hours later. And all of this aligns remarkably well with the gospel narrative. The man was mocked, crowned with thorns, scourged, crucified, pierced in the side, died, wrapped in a fine burial shroud, and on the 3rd day, he rose again, the sign of Jonah, and a blood. Number 3, in the Gospels, Jesus says, "This evil generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." The presenter points out a strange detail on the shroud. On the forehead of the man in the cloth is a blood stain shaped like the number 3. This mark also appears on the heel, on the back of the head, and on the Sudarium of Oviedo, another cloth associated with the burial. In thousands of forensic and crime scene photographs, people do not see blood accidentally forming a clear 3 shape on the side of a head, on clothing, or on objects. Is this just coincidence, or a deliberate signature? The presenter is convinced this is the sign of Jonah placed visibly on the burial cloth, the portrait of the author, and the portrait of God the Father. If this is an intentional image, created by will, by an invisible artist, what kind of person would that be, based on the level of finesse, precision, gentleness, and power in the image? The presenter constructs a kind of character profile. Very bold, willing to do something never seen before. Very intelligent, mastering mathematics, optics, and physics at a supreme level. Very careful, because he acts only on 1,000 fibrils and keeps the same depth across the entire cloth. Very creative, combining in one image the properties of a negative, an X-ray, and a hologram. Very loving and compassionate, clearly wanting to portray the suffering of the man in the cloth. Very self-giving, because this image is made for all humanity to see, not just for a small secret group. One thing does not fit. If this were a hoax or a forgery, the author would have to be a liar and deceiver. Yet the entire profile outlined above does not match a fraudster. The presenter concludes, this is the portrait of a creator, a father, and the man in the cloth is the son, Jesus. The phrase, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, is used to say, the character of the one who made the image resembles the character of the one who lived, suffered, died, and rose again, the Jesus of the Gospels. So what, ultimately, is the Shroud of Turin? In summary, the presenter proposes this definition. The Shroud of Turin is a photographic X-ray holographic image recorded on linen by UVB laser-like radiation emitted from the body of a man who died and rose again. It is not a painting, an ordinary photograph, a machine-made X-ray, or a technological hologram. Instead, it is a one-time event in physical history. Matching a one-time event in salvation history, the resurrection of Jesus, not to worship a cloth, but to answer a question. The presenter emphasizes, the goal is not to get people to worship a piece of cloth. It is not to ask anyone to send money, join a particular denomination, or chase after a holy object like a charm. What matters far more is the question that the Shroud of Turin asks. Who do you say the man in this cloth is? If all of materials science, light and radiation physics, forensic medicine, history, and even theological science all lean in one direction, that this is the preserved image of Jesus after the resurrection, then each person must answer for themselves. The presenter ends with a very simple invitation. If you believe, if something in your heart is moved by this, and then seek faith and baptism, not to follow a human organization, but to enter into the eternal life promised by the man whose image appears on that shroud. In this view, the Shroud of Turin is not just a controversial relic, it is a testimony written in light, encoded in mathematics, inscribed into linen fibers, sent from the 1st century to today's generation, asking you one question: who do you say I am?